Well, if you want to know about me, first of all, as you know, I'm a transplant here. We've owned the farm for many years since our own children were young and wanted to own a horse. But we've only lived out here for the 20 years. And so I guess really to try to talk about my life out here would not be all that valuable. I mean, people you have talked to who spent their lifetimes here and have been part of the community since they were children would certainly have a better perspective on that. So I guess if I had to talk about something, I'd talk about my life up to my retirement, and except for when I was in the Army and in an internship, was pretty well spent in the cities in Minneapolis. I was born in Minneapolis, grew up there, practiced there my whole life as a doctor. And so what I really know is what life in Minneapolis was like from the late 1930s until I retired in 1995. So to what extent that might be of interest to anybody, and might be in times to come. To give a perspective on what life in general was like then, my parents left school and started their lives as adults at the height of the Depression. My father was a doctor, just starting out, and in those days there was no such thing as health insurance, and nobody really had money, or if they did, they spent it very cautiously. As he said, pork chops were only a quarter, but nobody had a quarter. And so that was sort of the attitude at the time. My mother was a school teacher, but in those days you couldn't be a female school teacher and be married. And so they had married but didn't tell anybody. But when she was pregnant with me, I guess not too many months went by when she had to admit to her principal that she was married and pregnant, and at that time she was let go. So that would have been 1934. And they lived in a small duplex, and I think they lived there until I was a few months old. I'm not sure exactly how many. I have no recollection of that, of course. But they then moved in with my grandparents, and again, to just give you a flavor for the age, both because they were glad to move someplace where the rent was cheaper, and also because my grandfather, whose source of income was that he ran a pool hall, was falling behind on his house payments, and it could very well have been foreclosed. And so by them moving together, they both saved money, and it was beneficial. But it was a house of modest size, I suppose a couple thousand square feet with 3 bedrooms. My parents slept on an unheated 3-season back porch. I had a bedroom. My maiden aunt, who also lived there, had a bedroom, and my grandparents had a bedroom. And for me, of course, it was a happy time, but because I had a happy childhood rather than because of anything to do with the times. I had a little sister who was born three and a half years later, and so by that point, things were really getting crowded, and I think at that point, my folks built a house, which was shortly before World War II, 1940, I believe. And that was sort of right on the edge of the city on 56th and First Avenue. And for people who don't know the city limits at that time was 58th Street, and there were farms out beyond that. the city limits is 62nd Street, but it's pretty much unbroken housing all the way out to the Minnesota River, 8 or 10 miles further south and across off to both sides. So it was a much smaller city at that time, and also a much simpler lives. It was not at all uncommon for a family to not have a car, and for the man of the house to take the streetcar to work. And the women of the house rarely worked. And of course, during World War II, which started at the end of 1941, there was strict gas rationing, so even if you did have a car, you could hardly drive it, at least if you were in the lowest priority for getting gasoline. My father, as a doctor, had a high priority. There were 3 levels, and he had the highest level, being what they considered essential, but even that meant he could drive to work. And I think maybe once in every 3 or 4 years we could go on a vacation. So even that, and that was the highest priority. So people didn't move around much. The city was small. They took the bus. And the neighborhoods were quite stable. The same people lived on both sides of our block. When I was 20 and moved out, well, I didn't move out, 21 or 22, I still knew the names of most of the people up and down the block that had lived there when we moved in 1940, when I was 5. So that was just the way life was. So that was kind of the background that I grew up in. There, it was a neighborhood with no crime. And while I didn't get along with every kid in the neighborhood, then it was certainly a middle class to even lower middle class neighborhood. I mean, there were plenty of guys who worked in factories or goodness knows what, people who lived in houses that were not more than twice the size of this room. So there were people at all ends of the income spectrum. For a family to own 2 automobiles was unheard of. I mean, it was unimaginable. And as I said, vacations at the most were a few days at some ma-and-pa resort. But of course, roads in those days weren't that good, and it was half a day to drive 100 miles. The roads were designed to go through every little town between where you were living and where you were trying to get to. So that took a long time, and roads were in poor repair. That was kind of the environment that I grew up in. I was fortunate in living in a middle-class neighborhood where, while certainly not everybody went to college, especially the girls, but certainly a number did. But nevertheless, if you got anything above C's in high school, you kind of anticipated going to the university at least, and most of us did just go to the University of Minnesota. But tuition when I started was just $33 a quarter, so a whole year's tuition at the University of Minnesota would have been $100. So obviously it was a price that pretty much any family could afford, and so if the kid had an interest, it was something we did. But compared to my own grandchildren who've been all over the world, I was not out of the state of Minnesota until I was 15, at which point I went to the first Boy Scout Jamboree in America after World War II, which was in Valley Forge in 1950. So that we were kind of provincial folks, and I speak of a person who was, in quote, relatively sophisticated. I'm not trying to say was the most sophisticated kid at our high school by a long way, but on the other hand, there wasn't anybody else in our high school, and which was one of the better high schools in Minneapolis, who'd seen much more of the world than I had, or who went away any distance to college. Almost everybody went to, if not the university, at least to some small college in Minnesota. So that was the kind of environment that we grew up in. The war itself, I remember it starting, and I remember what was going on in it to some extent, but we were pretty well detached. My own father had just barely missed a draft. He was just a bit too old. I didn't have any older brothers or even cousins who were of an age to be in the armed forces. There were people up and down the block that did have the little flag in the window that indicated they had a son in the service, and occasionally even one that had the changing of the colors of the star that indicated that one of them had died. But that was still, for a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old, that wasn't a terribly meaningful thing. The most significant thing to us was the fact there was a lot of rationing. So we had pretty restricted meat and butter, and some items, clothing items and so forth, were hard to come by. But, when you're 5 or 6 or 7 years old, what do you expect? One of the main things that impacted my life was that you were encouraged to be a member of the Clean Plate Club. And so if your mother sent a note to school telling the teacher that you'd always cleaned your plate, you got to put a little plate up above the blackboard claiming that honor. So that was the sort of thing that 6 or 7-year-olds made of the war. So you can see that wasn't of any great importance. As I say, my own background was certainly one of coming up where money counted. And I think my parents passed that on to us, having started their married life in the Depression. And really, things didn't get better for most people until the war, or just before the war, when President Roosevelt started rearming, and which time the jobs became more plentiful and sort of the good times started to return. But I'm just saying that because it's something that's carried forward in our lives. To see people nowadays fretting about income levels and whatnot, I could maybe understand it in some senses of the word, but I see people who were in the socioeconomic strata where then they couldn't afford any vehicle at all. They're now making payments on $40,000 pickup trucks. It's really hard to totally relate to their pain when I grew up in an era where there wouldn't have been anybody on our entire block who could have afforded a vehicle that was even close to that, including my own father. And that's carried forward with us. And so while we certainly live a life that's just fine, it doesn't have half of the gadgets and whatnot that my kids and grandkids seem to feel are essential in their lives. I guess the only other area that I would comment on, without your encouragement, would be starting out as a doctor. I was in training in my specialty until I was 28, and then had to spend 2 years in the Army, which was not too long after the Vietnam War got serious. I didn't personally go over to Vietnam, but I had a number of doctor friends that did, and I trained special operations medics. So that was as close as I got, but nevertheless, that was where I was. When I got out of the Army and went into private practice, Medicare and Medicaid hadn't started. Medical insurance was starting to come in, but it was mainly it was exclusively only for hospitalizations. And so people who came to the office paid out of their pocket, and therefore there wasn't all of the requirements for insurance and so forth, and therefore medical care was also cheaper. A person could come in my office and see me for $6, where that same service I noticed today is about 70. So in that sense, it was a simpler time, and of course, it was also a time with a lot less technology, all of which we have now. Almost everything that a doctor needed to do, with the exception of certain specialized x-rays, a doctor could do in his own office, and that was pretty much the end of that. We couldn't do anything more than take chest x-rays, so certainly people were sent to radiologists for other reasons, but it was, by today's comparisons, a much lower tech medicine. And I won't go into all the ways it's evolved ever since, but it seems like for every solution a new problem crops up, so I'm not sure if people are any happier. So I'll just end there and ask you to suggest any areas that you have an interest in that I haven't filled in.
Do you remember the old radio dramas?
Well, yes, I do, but those would mostly be from my childhood. So it would be things like The Lone Ranger and Captain Midnight and programs like that. Although I do remember some of the evening programs, Lux Radio Theater and Intersanctum. I have one funny story. The first time I babysat my little sister, I was probably 10 or 12, and they'd gone next door or someplace. And as they left, they said, "Dan, we don't want you to listen to Intersanctum. It's too scary." So, of course, as soon as they were out the door, what did I do but turn on Intersanctum and scared myself out of my wits and turned off the radio and ran up to bed and covered my head with the blanket and waited for them to come home. So I guess that would be my introduction to Intersanctum.
What's your favorite type of music?
I guess in terms of music, well, first of all, I'm not musical. I mean, I can't carry a tune and so forth. But I guess the one time when I was more into music was in college, and at that time, folk music was sort of the thing. John Denver and such like, and that was what appealed to me. The more modern stuff, the stuff my kids and grandkids listen to, I don't understand and has absolutely no appeal.
Completely understandable. What do you fear most for the future generations?
Well, I guess I don't have an answer for that. I guess I don't fear. I guess that it's so typical for old people to say the world is changing, that must be a bad thing. Goodness gracious, what's going to happen to everybody else? But, if you read history, old men have been saying that since about 1000 BC, so I doubt that there'll be any fewer challenges nor any more challenges than I have seen in my own lifetime, for sure, and we did get through them all.
Thanks. That's a great answer. All right, here's another question. This one's kind of a curveball. What mystery do you wish would have been solved?
Whew.
Like UFOs or Loch Ness Monster or something.
Oh, I see. I thought you meant scientific, serious thing. Well, this is, I mean, talking about things are of no great consequence unless they prove to be in times to come. But this was a big UFO area, as I'm sure you probably know from other interviews. And a number of people saw these objects, people who didn't report them. They all occurred in a quite defined period of time, and then just were gone. And while I haven't the slightest idea of what they were, I don't think they were either people looking for publicity, nor were they people who were sort of crazy either. I think something was there. I have no idea what it was. It now is gone, and the only residue is UFO days and a few aging signs along the highway.
Let's see, next. What do you consider the greatest invention of your lifetime?
Probably the transistor, I would guess, has certainly been the thing that's caused more changes in my lifetime than anything else.
Can you talk a little bit about all your travels?
When I got engaged, my wife assured me she was an outdoor girl, which actually meant that she went, when she was a kid, she'd gone to Girl Scout camp out by Lake Minnetonka. But I didn't let her off the hook, and I had always been a person who had spent a lot of time in the outdoors. So I started dragging her on camping trips. Even when children were babies, then we had to pawn them off grandparents. And that kind of evolved. Our own children grew up with backpacks on. My youngest daughter, once when she was struggling up a mountainside in the hot midday sun, said, "When I grow up, I'm only going to do day hikes." And they kept it up with us until they were well into college. But anyway, kind of our travels grew out of that as the kids left home. Even when they were with us, we started going further afield. So it was very common to go out to the western mountains for a week or two each summer for our summer vacation. And then as they got into their teens, we first went to Alaska one summer, and then I believe the next summer, it was about 1974 maybe, we went and did some hiking and backpacking in Norway. And so when they were in college out on their own and not going with us, we started going even further afield and have tried to get into the outdoors in as many different environments as we could, and have done that on every continent except Australia. So we've been from islands in the Arctic Ocean up above Canada down to Antarctica, and from, of course, United States to the Alps in Europe, Italy and Switzerland, to the Himalayas, to New Zealand, been to Central and South America, both in Brazil, but especially down in Argentina and Chile and Patagonia there. So those have, and into Africa. We've hiked there, climbed up Kilimanjaro one year. So those sort of things have all evolved. Unfortunately, now that I'm in my 80s, I'm finding it hard to put my backpack on and climb the side of a mountain like I'd like to. But so I'm afraid we're on the downhill side of it, and most of it is just what you see pasted on the walls here now.
If a person could only go to one of the places that you've been, which one would you recommend?
Well, I don't think that's a question that can be accurately answered. The simple reason being, the most spectacular places wouldn't be places you do as your first trip. You know, it's like saying if I was going to build a piece of furniture, which is the most spectacular piece of furniture you've ever built, and therefore I could maybe copy your design and do one myself? And the answer would be, well, okay, good luck. Because those things require planning, and they require understanding what your own capabilities are and knowing how to train for whatever the new situation would be. And probably the best example, the most extreme example, although not the one that I'd say was my most cherished visit, but the one I would use because it was kind of extreme, was climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, which is over 19,000 feet high. And in getting ready for that, I knew I had to, get in good shape. So I was out running, which I hate doing, by the way, but I was out running 2-3 times a week at least, and hiking with my backpack, and even trying to strengthen my legs by putting on a 90-pound pack and then climbing a dozen flights of stairs. And somebody such as yourself, reasonably fit and athletic, you would not really have an idea of how far you were from being able to get to the top of the mountain. I mean, maybe it'd be a cakewalk for you. Who knows? I don't know at all what your capabilities are. So I think a person, plus the fact that you have to be happy sleeping in a small tent on a thin foam pad every night for 2 weeks and eating strange food, and so I think of my own kids when they would go, say, most often on a canoe trip with the youth group at the church. And there were kids that had never done that. They'd done it all their, lives. And so for them it was just something that they did because the other kids were doing it. And some of the kids were totally decompensated. They just, the weather wasn't quite what they wanted, the food wasn't what they wanted, and they'd lay down on the ground and kick and scream. And they were just totally out of their element because they'd started at a level where they weren't comfortable. So, but if you wanted to make a long answer even longer, I guess the most spectacular or interesting thing I ever did was hike the Inca Trail from near Cusco to Machu Picchu. And that's so fascinating because that was kind of the royal road between those two, the political and the spiritual capitals of the Inca Empire. And so the whole way is at least in fair part paved with stone pavers, and there's just a whole series of spectacular religious sites which are moderately well preserved, but where you can walk right into them and wander around in them, whereas, of course, here you're behind fences 100 yards away from them. But there, they were just on the trail, and we'd walk into one or another and look at them every day. So that was and then, of course, Machu Picchu, walking down into it the way the Incas would have come, which they came in from a high gate that at noon would have the sun right at their back, rather than taking a bus up from the town down below it by the way that most of the tourists did, and being able to look down on this, that was certainly a spectacular. But again, it's not something that I would even be willing to do now, and certainly wouldn't advise people doing to start, because it's just you go 30 miles in 3 days, and it isn't as high as Kilimanjaro, but you do go over passes that are 12 to 14,000 feet high, and so with even a moderate pack on, why that's a pretty challenging outing.
As I heard it, you built this entire house by yourself. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. Obviously, some of these beams, which are put up green, weighed 1,000 or 1,500 pounds, and I certainly didn't do that. What I did do, there's a picture in the other room of the little old farmhouse. And when we were getting ready to retire and decided to move here, we decided that wasn't adequate. It was probably well under 800 square feet, and it had a very poor basement, and the septic system was nowhere near up to code. So after some thought, we decided to build. So I drew up the plan for the house here, but after again some thought, realized that there was no way I was going to put up the main timber frame. I did cut the frame for the utility room out there where you came in, but heck, that took me a couple of 3 months just to do that, from timbers I'd gotten up at Schmidt Timber. So anyway, I looked around and I found a timber framer, and I thought was, I still think he is quite creative. A lot of people who put up timber frames, and I guess maybe there aren't really a lot of them, just use a computer and take the plan, and the computer spits out the timbers. But this guy has kind of an artistic flair. His shop was or is in Cambridge, Minnesota. So the long and short of it is, I contracted with him. I also obviously had a contractor who dug the hole, and another one who put in the foundation. I hired a carpenter who worked with me. He put it in the subfloor, and then the timber framer came and erected the timber frame and nailed the walls to it. This house is built kind of like a skyscraper, in the sense that you have a frame and then walls are affixed to that. The walls aren't load-bearing. So these walls kind of look like ice cream sandwiches with a styrofoam middle and a couple of layers of particle board, chipboard glued to each side. And then he had a big crane and lifted those panels up and nailed them on the walls, and then he left. And so it was up to us to do everything else, starting with putting in the windows, shingling the roof, and kind of worked from there. I had the carpenter, Pat Beckel, down in town here for about 3 months. He helped, and friends helped, and we enclosed the house and roofed it and started putting on the siding, I think, if I can remember right. Well, then he left, and then I had to go from there to putting in the plumbing and electrical and the heating. I wasn't planning on putting on the heating, but the contractor backed out, and so I had to learn how to put in my own heating system. And then the next summer, we went back to finishing the outside of the house, putting on all the siding. But just because I'm that kind of a person, I did all of the millwork in the house. So everything from the floors to those bookcases to the closet doors to window trim and just about anything you could imagine, I made myself rather than try to purchase it, which I could have, of course, done. And so the whole affair took me 5 years from start to finish, although I'd have to say mostly after the first year and a half or 2 years, I took summers off and did whatever we wanted to, go backpacking or whatever we wanted to do, or work up at the church, and just worked on the house, during the cold weather months.
It's got to feel really rewarding to live in a house that you did most of the work on.
Well, yeah, I obviously, there's a certain amount of ego gratification in doing this sort of thing. Also, I've been working with wood since I was in my 20s, your age, or maybe even a bit younger. And so it's just what I do, other than, be a doctor, which I don't do anymore. So That's been my other interest in life, is I guess been working with wood. So in that sense, yes, I am proud of it, but on the other hand, it's nothing new.
Do you have like a philosophy about woodworking?
I don't think that's the right word. I mean, there are philosophical woodworkers. I'm not one of them. I think it's more, do I have an attitude about woodworking? Because more than once, many times, in matter of fact, somebody will either ask me to help them with a project, or if I'm working with other people in a volunteers and mission trip, and come on across other people's attitudes. And I find more often than not I'm at odds with them, because my attitude about woodworking is the only acceptable way to do it is to do your best. And not that my best is perfect, but to do a second-rate job, knowing I'm doing a second-rate job, is something I can't abide. And so I guess that's it. And because of that attitude, I think that kind of perfectionist attitude, I think that's driven me to be a better and better woodworker as I certainly have continued to take on more and more difficult projects as years go by. Even though I'm now in my 80s, I still, I'm not saying, well, I'm in my 80s, so I'll do something simpler. That may be true with backpacking, but it isn't true with woodworking. The more difficult the project, the more challenging I find it.
You've experienced both the city life and farm life. What made you choose the farm life?
Well, yeah, of course, there's lots of kinds of city life that I don't know a thing about. I grew up in a very stable, low-crime, middle-class neighborhood. And I've already told you a little about that. And when I was in practice, I lived in Edina, which is an upper middle class neighborhood. The contrast between that and this is quite remarkable. They're both low crime, basically pretty much law-abiding areas, but people were sort of all cut from the same cookie cutter there. They all had upper middle class incomes, did upper middle class things, had upper middle class values. Where out here, first of all, people are a lot more informal out here. They're a lot easier to meet. After living where I lived in the cities for 30 years, there probably weren't 4 or 5 people on the block or 2 around me that I even had a speaking acquaintanceship with. Where I have a speaking acquaintanceship with everybody up and down the road here. And here, people have really very different socioeconomic backgrounds. Everything from obviously my own background, but Randy Blanchard, the veterinarian, be another person, well-educated, and another friend down around the corner who had a responsible job in industry before he retired, all the way to people who in the neighborhood who I doubt have made it through high school, and people who have really pretty low-paying, low-tech jobs. And they're all fine people, but it's just a much more heterogeneous group, and people out here are really much more individuals. They do some of the strangest things I've ever seen in my life, which you just never saw back there in the city. So I personally enjoy it a lot.